The first snow of November had settled over the little frontier town of Ash Hollow like a white quilt stitched by heaven itself. Frost clung to every fence rail, every pine branch, and every rooftop, muting the world into a quiet stillness. Smoke drifted lazily from stone chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of oak firewood through the crisp morning air. Families hurried along the muddy streets bundled in thick coats, preparing for another long winter on the American frontier. At the edge of town stood a weathered cottage with faded blue shutters and a tiny vegetable garden now buried beneath the snow. It was neither the poorest house nor the finest, but it had become almost invisible to the townsfolk. Most people passed it without a second glance, though everyone knew who lived there. Clara Whitmore. At 32 years old, Clara had already lived through more sorrow than many endured in an entire lifetime. 7 winters earlier she had married Thomas Whitmore, a cheerful blacksmith whose booming laugh could be heard halfway down Main Street. Their little home had once been filled with dreams of children, harvest festivals, and peaceful evenings beside the fireplace. Thomas had built every piece of furniture with his own hands, carving tiny wildflowers into the headboard of their bed because Clara loved the blossoms that grew along the creek each spring. When their son Samuel was born, happiness seemed complete. But frontier life was often as cruel as it was beautiful. The winter Samuel turned 6 months old was the harshest anyone could remember. Snowstorms trapped families inside for weeks. Food became scarce. Bitter winds slipped through cracks in walls no matter how carefully they were sealed. Samuel caught a fever first. Thomas rode through a blizzard searching for the nearest doctor nearly 20 miles away, but by the time he returned, carrying medicine wrapped inside his coat, it was too late. The tiny crib stood heartbreakingly still. Thomas never truly recovered from the loss. He buried himself in endless hours at the forge until exhaustion and pneumonia finally claimed him before the following spring. In less than a year, Clara had buried both her child and her husband beneath the same lonely oak tree overlooking the cemetery hill. People had brought casseroles, blankets, and prayers during those first difficult months. They meant well. But grief lingers long after sympathy fades. Years passed. Neighbors slowly stopped knocking. Invitations to church picnics became less frequent. Children who once played near her garden grew into adults who scarcely remembered her smile. Then came the trembling. It had begun almost unnoticed, a slight quiver whenever Clara poured tea or threaded a needle. She blamed exhaustion at first. Later she blamed the cold. Eventually the shaking refused to leave. Some mornings she struggled to button her own dress. On others she dropped cups, spilled flour, or scattered seeds before they ever reached the soil. Doctors were rare on the frontier, and those who examined her offered little comfort. Too much strain, one suggested. A woman's nerves, another declared with a shrug. No medicine helped. The shaking became part of her life. In a town where nearly every woman earned respect through sewing quilts, baking bread, preserving vegetables, and caring for bustling households, Clara could no longer perform even the simplest tasks without embarrassment. She stopped attending quilting circles after pricking her fingers until tiny drops of blood stained the fabric. She quit bringing pies to church suppers because she feared dropping them before reaching the table. Even pouring coffee for guests became an ordeal she dreaded. Eventually she simply stopped inviting anyone inside. Instead, Clara found quiet routines that asked little of her trembling hands. Each morning she wrapped herself in Thomas's old wool coat and stepped into her small garden. Though winter now covered it in snow, she still checked the fences and spoke softly to the sleeping earth, already dreaming of spring peas, carrots, and wildflowers. Books became her closest companions. Every Saturday she borrowed another worn novel or history from Pastor Reynolds, whose tiny church library contained only a few dozen volumes. Clara read beside the fireplace until the candles burned low, escaping into stories where hope somehow survived heartbreak. The townspeople viewed her with gentle pity. "There goes poor Clara," some whispered as she walked through the market. "Such a shame. She never recovered." Others spoke more harshly. What man would marry a woman who can't even thread a needle? She'll spend the rest of her life alone. Though Clara rarely heard the words directly, she felt them in lingering stares and awkward silences whenever she entered a room. She learned to keep her eyes lowered. To smile politely. To leave before anyone noticed her hands trembling. Yet beneath all the grief, beneath every quiet apology she offered for herself, Clara remained deeply kind. One freezing afternoon she discovered a stray puppy shivering beneath her porch. Though her fingers shook as she wrapped it in an old blanket, she held the frightened animal against her chest until it stopped trembling. "You don't have to be perfect," she whispered softly to the little creature. "You just have to keep going." She did not realize she was speaking to herself as much as to the puppy. As evening settled over Ash Hollow, Clara lit a single oil lamp in the front window of her lonely cottage. Its warm glow spilled onto the snow-covered path, a small beacon against the darkness. Inside, she sat quietly with a book resting on her lap. Her hands trembled as always, but she turned each page with patient determination. She could not know that before winter gave way to spring, someone would look beyond those shaking hands and see the steadfast, compassionate heart they had carried through years of unimaginable loss. For now, however, Clara believed what the town had quietly taught her to believe, that she was too broken to be chosen, too limited to be loved, and destined to spend the rest of her days alone. She was wrong. Winter lingered over Ash Hollow well into February, refusing to loosen its icy grip on the little frontier town. The roads were muddy where wagon wheels had carved deep ruts through melting snow, and the morning still carried a sharp bite that made every breath rise like smoke. Yet despite the stubborn cold, there was a quiet promise in the air. Birds had begun returning to the bare cottonwood trees, and patches of green grass peeked through the frost along the creek. Life in Ash Hollow stirred awake again. Merchants reopened their doors after the hardest weeks of winter, children filled the streets with laughter, and ranchers came into town to purchase supplies before the busy spring season began. Among them was Daniel Mercer. At 42 years old, Daniel was a man whose broad shoulders and weathered face told the story of years spent beneath the open sky. His dark hair had begun turning silver at the temples, and fine lines framed his steady gray eyes. He wasn't known for speaking much, but when he did, people listened. Honest, dependable, and fair, Daniel had earned the respect of nearly everyone in the county. Like Clara, he knew what it meant to lose the life he had once imagined. His wife, Eleanor, had died 5 years earlier after a long illness. They had never been blessed with children, and when she passed, the ranch became painfully quiet. Daniel buried himself in work, believing endless days repairing fences, tending cattle, and riding the pastures would somehow ease the loneliness waiting for him each evening. It never did. The ranch remained well cared for, but the house had become little more than a place to sleep. Each morning he cooked the same plain breakfast. Each evening he ate supper alone. The silence settled around him like another layer of dust. He had long ago accepted that perhaps this was simply how the rest of his life would be. One chilly Saturday morning, Daniel drove his wagon into Ash Hollow to buy seed, horseshoes, lamp oil, and flour. The town square bustled with activity as farmers discussed the coming planting season and children chased one another between market stalls. Daniel nodded politely to familiar faces while loading supplies into his wagon. As he reached the general store, a sudden cry caught his attention. A young boy had stumbled while running across the muddy street. His knee struck a sharp stone, and he burst into frightened tears. Before anyone else reacted, a woman stepped forward. Daniel watched as Clara Whitmore knelt carefully beside the child. Her hands trembled noticeably as she reached into her coat pocket for a clean handkerchief. The cloth shook between her fingers while she gently wiped the dirt from the boy's scraped knee. "I'm all right," the boy sniffled. "I know you are," Clara said with a warm smile. "But brave boys deserve clean bandages too." Her fingers struggled slightly as she tied the cloth around his leg. She had to try twice before the knot held. The boy didn't seem to notice. Instead, he smiled through his tears. "Thank you, Miss Clara." His mother hurried over, offering embarrassed apologies. "I'm sorry," she said. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself." "It wasn't any trouble," Clara replied softly. Daniel couldn't explain why the brief moment stayed with him. He had seen dozens of women care for children. But there had been something different about Clara. She never complained about her shaking hands. She never seemed embarrassed when the knot took longer than expected. All Daniel noticed was the kindness in her voice. Later that afternoon, he found himself asking the storekeeper, "Mr. Collins, how has Mrs. Whitmore been these days?" The old merchant glanced toward the window where Clara disappeared down the street. "Quiet as ever," he answered. Daniel waited. Mr. Collins sighed. "Poor woman's had more heartache than anyone deserves. Lost her husband. Lost her baby. Now those hands won't stop shaking. I noticed. Most folks reckon she'll stay alone. Hard life for a woman who can't sew much or bake like she used to." Daniel frowned. "Seems people judge too quickly." Mr. Collins shrugged. "That's small towns for you." Daniel climbed into his wagon, but Clara's gentle smile lingered in his thoughts all the way back to the ranch. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed more often than either expected. Sunday mornings, they sat a few pews apart in the small white church. Market days, they greeted each other with polite smiles. Sometimes they exchanged a few words about the weather, the early wildflowers blooming near the creek, or the stubborn winter refusing to leave. Their conversations were simple. Yet Daniel found himself looking forward to them. Unlike many people, he never stared at Clara's trembling hands. He looked at her eyes. They were a soft shade of blue, thoughtful and kind, carrying both sadness and quiet strength. Clara, however, struggled to understand his friendliness. Why would a respected rancher continue speaking with someone like her? Each time they met, she became painfully aware of every tremor. When she handed him a basket of fresh herbs one afternoon, a few sprigs slipped from her grasp. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, bending to gather them. Daniel knelt beside her. "No apology needed." "My hands," she whispered. "I noticed." Heat rushed into Clara's cheeks. "I'm afraid they always do that." Daniel simply smiled. "I've worked with frightened horses most of my life. Strong things shake sometimes too." She looked up in surprise. No one had ever spoken about her trembling with such gentleness. Most people pretended not to see it. Others pitied her. Daniel did neither. As spring slowly awakened the prairie with green grass and blooming wildflowers, something unexpected began growing between them, not romance, not yet, but the quiet beginning of trust. For the first time in many years, Clara found herself lingering after church instead of hurrying home. She discovered that conversations felt easier when Daniel was nearby, because he never rushed her, never stared when her hands shook, and never treated her as though she were fragile. Daniel, too, sensed a change within himself. The loneliness that had settled over his ranch for so long seemed a little less heavy after each conversation with Clara. Neither of them realized that the simple kindness they offered each other was quietly laying the foundation for a love neither had dared hope to find again. The greatest test, however, still lay ahead, for Clara carried a secret fear deep within her heart, a fear that no amount of friendship could erase unless someone proved that love was stronger than her shame. Spring settled gently over Ash Hollow, washing away the last traces of winter. The cottonwood trees along the creek unfurled fresh green leaves, wildflowers painted the meadows with bursts of yellow and purple, and the air carried the sweet scent of damp earth after every afternoon rain. The town seemed lighter somehow, as though the long months of cold had finally released their hold on everyone's spirits. For Clara Whitmore, however, the warmth of the season could not quiet the storm inside her. Her friendship with Daniel Mercer had become the brightest part of her days. Every Tuesday, he found an excuse to ride into town. Sometimes he claimed he needed nails from the blacksmith. Other times he stopped by the general store for lamp oil or coffee, though Clara suspected his pantry was already well stocked. More often than not, their paths crossed naturally. If she was tending the church garden, Daniel would offer to carry buckets of water. If she was walking home with a basket of vegetables, he insisted on helping without making it seem like charity. Their conversation stretched longer each week. They spoke about books Clara loved, about the stars that filled the prairie sky on clear nights, and about the memories of the people they had lost. One afternoon, while repairing the crooked gate outside her cottage, Daniel paused to admire the rows of flowers blooming beside the porch. "You planted all these?" he asked. Clara nodded. "They're not much. They're beautiful." She smiled faintly. "They bloom whether anyone notices them or not." Daniel looked at her for a moment before replying. "I think that's what makes them beautiful." His words lingered in her mind long after he rode away. As the weeks passed, Daniel's visits became part of the rhythm of Clara's life. He never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes he brought fresh eggs from his hens. Other times it was a bundle of firewood, a sack of flour, or a book borrowed from a traveling merchant. When something around the cottage needed fixing, Daniel quietly repaired it without asking for thanks. One afternoon he mended a loose porch step while Clara prepared tea inside. As she carried the cups toward the table, her hands suddenly trembled harder than usual. The porcelain rattled against the saucers. She tried to steady herself. Just one more step. The cup slipped. It shattered across the wooden floor. Hot tea splashed over her shoes. Clara froze. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Daniel immediately reached for a towel. "Don't worry. I've ruined everything. You dropped a cup." "I always do." She knelt quickly to gather the broken pieces, but her shaking fingers only made the task more difficult. A sharp edge sliced across her thumb. A drop of blood landed on the floor. Daniel gently caught her wrist. "Careful." His voice carried no frustration. Only concern. Yet Clara could no longer hold back the shame she had buried for years. Tears blurred her vision. "You shouldn't have to keep pretending." "Pretending? That you don't notice." Daniel remained silent. "My hands shake every day," she said, her voice breaking. "Sometimes they're worse than this. I can't sew straight stitches anymore. I burn bread because I spill the flour. I break dishes. I can't even pour tea without making a mess." She pulled her hand away and wrapped both trembling hands tightly together. "I used to make quilts. I baked pies for every church supper. Thomas always said no one could stitch a blanket warmer than mine." Her eyes filled with tears. "Now I can hardly thread a needle." The room fell painfully quiet. Outside, birds sang in the trees as though nothing had changed. Inside, Clara felt years of hidden sorrow rising all at once. "I know people talk," she whispered. "They think I'm broken." Daniel didn't interrupt. "They're right." She forced herself to continue. "No man wants a wife who can't keep a proper home." She laughed softly through her tears. "I suppose I wouldn't either." Daniel looked at her with such sadness that it made her heart ache. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he slowly knelt beside her. He picked up one of the broken pieces of porcelain and set it aside before gently taking her trembling hands into his own. They shook against his rough, calloused palms. He didn't let go. Instead, he smiled. "Clara." She couldn't meet his eyes. "My hands shake too much to sew or cook," she confessed at last. The word she had feared for years finally escaped. She expected silence. She expected pity. Perhaps even a quiet goodbye. Instead, Daniel squeezed her hands a little tighter. "I only need them to hold mine." The words were spoken so simply that for a moment Clara wondered if she had imagined them. She looked up. There was no hesitation in his face. No disappointment. No trace of pity. Only honesty. I've never come here because I wanted perfect bread, he continued. I never noticed whether your stitches were straight. What I noticed was the woman who fed a hungry puppy in winter. The woman who comforts frightened children. The woman who still plants flowers after burying everyone she loved. His voice grew softer. Those hands may shake. But they've carried more courage than most steady hands ever will. Clara's tears fell freely now. Years of shame seemed to loosen their grip with every word he spoke. No doctor had ever healed her trembling. No sermon had erased her loneliness. Yet somehow this quiet rancher had reached the wound hidden deepest inside her heart. Daniel brushed away a tear with his thumb. You've spent years apologizing for something that doesn't change who you are. She whispered, you really don't mind? He chuckled gently. I've worked cattle my whole life. My hands ache every morning. My back reminds me of every fence I've ever built. We all carry something. He lifted her trembling hands slightly. I don't need perfect hands. I only need these. For the first time since Thomas and little Samuel had died, Clara allowed herself to believe something she had thought impossible. Perhaps she wasn't too broken to be loved. Perhaps the parts of herself she had hidden in shame were not the measure of her worth. Outside, the evening sun dipped below the hills, bathing the little cottage in warm golden light. Inside, two lonely hearts sat quietly together, their hands entwined. Nothing about Clara's trembling had changed. But everything about the way she saw herself had begun to. The weeks that followed Daniel's heartfelt confession were unlike anything Clara had experienced in years. For the first time since the deaths of Thomas and little Samuel, she found herself waking each morning with something she had almost forgotten, hope. Daniel continued visiting her cottage, though now there was no need for excuses. Sometimes they worked quietly in the garden together. Daniel dug rows for beans while Clara carefully planted the seeds, her trembling hands taking longer than most but no less determined. Other afternoons, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the prairie, talking about everything from childhood memories to dreams they had once believed were lost forever. The people of Ash Hollow noticed. In a town as small as theirs, nothing stayed secret for long. By the following Sunday, whispers had begun spreading through the church before the morning service had even started. I saw Daniel Mercer leaving Clara Whitmore's place after supper. They've been spending an awful lot of time together. Do you suppose he's courting her? Some smiled at the thought. Others frowned. After church, Clara lingered near the flower beds while Daniel spoke with a few ranchers. She couldn't help overhearing two women standing nearby. I never expected Daniel would choose her. Neither did I. He's one of the finest ranchers in the county. He could marry someone younger. Or someone who could actually run a household. Their voices dropped lower, but not low enough. Poor Clara can't even keep her hands still. Clara's smile faded. She quietly slipped away before anyone noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. Daniel heard different versions of the same gossip. At the general store, old Mr. Harlan leaned across the counter as Daniel purchased supplies. I hear you've taken a liking to Mrs. Whitmore. Daniel smiled. I have. The merchant hesitated. You're a good man, Daniel. I try to be. You've got a successful ranch. Daniel nodded. You need a wife who can help you. My ranch is doing just fine. Mr. Harlan lowered his voice. I'm only saying. Clara isn't exactly strong. Daniel calmly folded his receipt. You've mistaken strength for steady hands. The old man blinked. Daniel tipped his hat politely and walked away. The criticism became more personal a few days later when Daniel's older sister, Margaret, arrived from a neighboring county to visit. Margaret loved her brother deeply, but she also believed she knew what was best for him. As they sat on the ranch porch drinking coffee, she finally spoke her mind. So. Daniel smiled knowingly. So. I've heard about Clara. You probably have. Margaret sighed. Daniel, You've spent years rebuilding this ranch after Eleanor passed. I know. You deserve someone who can share the work. Daniel looked across the pasture where his horses grazed peacefully. I do have someone. Margaret frowned. She can't cook much. I can cook. She can't sew. I've managed without fancy shirts. Her health may never improve. Daniel turned toward his sister. Neither will mine. She looked surprised. He held out his rough hands. See these? She nodded. They're stiff every morning. My shoulder aches every time rain is coming. I'll never be 25 again. He smiled gently. Love isn't choosing the person with the fewest weaknesses. It's choosing the person whose heart feels like home. Margaret fell silent. She had never heard her quiet younger brother speak with such certainty. Unfortunately, Clara had heard enough whispers of her own to reach a different conclusion. One evening, as Daniel arrived carrying a basket of fresh peaches, he found her sitting alone on the porch. She looked unusually quiet. He immediately sensed something was wrong. Bad day? He asked. She forced a smile. I've been thinking. That can be dangerous. Normally she would have laughed. This time she didn't. Daniel. He sat beside her. I don't think we should keep seeing each other. The word struck him like a sudden winter wind. Why? She stared at her folded hands. They're right. Who's right? The town. He waited. You deserve someone who can give you children. Someone who can cook for your ranch hands. Someone who won't embarrass you every time she drops a plate. Daniel listened without interrupting. She continued quietly. I've already buried one husband. I won't spend the rest of my life wondering if I've ruined another man's happiness. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. Without saying a word, he offered her his hand. Confused, Clara took it. They walked together toward the center of town, where several neighbors were gathered outside the general store enjoying the cool evening. Conversation stopped as they approached. Daniel removed his hat. I'd like everyone's attention for a moment. The crowd grew silent. Clara felt her heart pounding. Daniel looked around at the familiar faces. I've heard some of the things being said. Several people shifted uncomfortably. I've heard Clara called weak. I've heard people say she isn't fit to be a rancher's wife. His voice remained calm. I disagree. He turned toward Clara. This woman has survived losses that would have broken many of us. She has faced every day with kindness instead of bitterness. She has never asked anyone to carry her burdens. He gently lifted her trembling hand into his own. Some of you see these hands and think they're a sign of weakness. I see the hands that comfort frightened children. The hands that plant flowers every spring after winters filled with sorrow. The hands that remind me courage isn't measured by how still you stand, but by whether you keep standing at all. The square became completely silent. Daniel looked directly at Clara. I don't love you because you're perfect. I love you because you're you. Then, before the entire town, he smiled the same gentle smile that had first begun healing her wounded heart. And if you'll have me, I'd be honored to spend the rest of my life holding your hand. Clara's trembling fingers tightened around his. For the first time in years, the whispers around her no longer mattered. The only voice she truly heard was the one that had chosen her, not in spite of her brokenness, but with full knowledge of it. And in that quiet moment, standing beneath the fading light of the prairie sky, she realized that real love did not ask for perfection. It simply asked two hearts to walk forward together, whatever burdens they carried. The wedding took place on a bright June morning, beneath the sprawling branches of the old oak tree that stood beside the little white church in Ash Hollow. Wildflowers bloomed across the nearby meadow, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of clover through the air. There were no elaborate decorations or expensive gifts, only rows of simple wooden benches filled with neighbors, friends, and family. Many of the same people who had once whispered about Clara now watched her walk slowly down the aisle on the arm of Pastor Reynolds. She wore a modest ivory dress that had belonged to her mother. Its lace sleeves were carefully mended by one of the women from church, for Clara's trembling hands had made sewing it herself impossible. As she reached Daniel, her hands quivered as they always did. Without hesitation, he smiled and took them into his own. "They're perfect," he whispered softly. Tears filled Clara's eyes. When Pastor Reynolds asked if Daniel would take Clara as his wife, he answered without the slightest pause. "I will." When Clara spoke her vows, her voice trembled almost as much as her hands. "I will." The church erupted in applause as they were pronounced husband and wife. For the first time in many years, Clara felt that her future was no longer something to fear. Life on Daniel's ranch settled into a peaceful rhythm. The work was demanding, but Daniel had never expected Clara to become someone she wasn't. "You don't have to prove anything," he reminded her one morning as they unpacked boxes in the farmhouse. "I still want to help." "You already do." She smiled. "I've only been here 3 days." "You've laughed more in those 3 days than this house has heard in 5 years. His words warmed her heart. Still, Clara longed to contribute in practical ways. She tried baking bread during her first week. The flour spilled across the kitchen table. The dough slipped from her trembling fingers. The loaf came out uneven and burned on one side. "I'm sorry," she sighed. Daniel cut himself a thick slice anyway. After taking a bite, he grinned. "I've eaten much worse." She laughed. "You're being kind." "I'm being truthful." He reached for another slice. "And besides, butter improves almost everything." His easy humor made her failures feel less like failures. As summer passed, Clara discovered there were many ways to care for a home that had nothing to do with steady hands. Daniel disliked keeping financial records. Receipts piled up on the kitchen table, and bills disappeared beneath seed catalogs and ranch maps. One rainy afternoon, Clara organized every account into neat ledgers. She had always loved numbers. Her handwriting remained beautiful despite the trembling, though writing required patience. When Daniel looked over the books that evening, his eyes widened. "I've been searching for this receipt for 2 months." Clara smiled. "It was tucked inside your Bible." He laughed. "I suppose that's a safe place." From then on, Clara became the ranch's bookkeeper. She tracked cattle sales, feed expenses, wages, and harvest profits with remarkable accuracy. Within a year, Daniel realized they were saving more money simply because nothing was forgotten anymore. "You've turned my chaos into order," he told her. "I only made a few lists." "You made a home." Word of Clara's kindness spread beyond the ranch. Every Wednesday afternoon, children from nearby farms began gathering in the Mercer's parlor. Some lived too far from the small schoolhouse to attend regularly. Others had parents who could barely read themselves. Clara welcomed them all. She taught letters using worn storybooks. She showed them how to write their names with careful strokes. When one little girl struggled to read aloud, Clara gently encouraged her. "Take your time." The child looked nervously at Clara's shaking hand resting on the book. "Does your hand hurt?" "Sometimes." "Then why don't you stop teaching?" Clara smiled. "Because some things are worth doing, even if they're difficult." The little girl thought for a moment. Then she nodded and continued reading. Lesson by lesson, Clara became known not for what she couldn't do, but for what she gave so freely, her patience, wisdom, and unwavering encouragement. Autumn arrived with fields of golden grass stretching toward the horizon. One afternoon, a traveling widow named Mrs. Collins stopped at the ranch seeking work. She looked exhausted. "I can cook," she said quietly. "I just need somewhere to stay until winter." Without hesitation, Clara invited her inside. Soon, lonely travelers, orphan children, and struggling families all discovered that the Mercer Ranch was a place where no one was turned away hungry. Daniel often returned from town to find extra chairs around the supper table. "You've adopted half the county," he joked one evening. Clara laughed. "I only added 2 tonight." He looked around the room. A pair of brothers whose parents had died the previous spring were helping stack firewood. Mrs. Collins stirred soup in the kitchen. 3 neighborhood children were reading books by the fireplace. The once silent ranch house was now filled with conversation and laughter. Daniel leaned close to Clara. "When I married you," he whispered, "I thought I was bringing one person home." She raised an eyebrow. "And? You brought an entire family." At the annual Harvest Festival, the mayor invited Daniel to speak about the success of his ranch. Standing before the gathered townspeople, Daniel surprised everyone. "If you think this ranch prospers because of me," he began, "you're mistaken." He looked toward Clara, who stood near the church ladies, her hands gently folded together. "My wife cannot mend every shirt. She cannot bake every loaf. She still drops dishes now and then." A few people smiled knowingly. "But she has taught children who couldn't read. She has welcomed strangers who had nowhere to sleep. She has kept our ranch running better than I ever could." He paused, his voice full of quiet pride. "The strongest person I know doesn't measure strength by what her hands can do. She measures it by what her heart refuses to stop giving." The crowd erupted into heartfelt applause. Clara lowered her head, tears filling her eyes once again. Years earlier, those same streets had echoed with whispers that she was broken. Now they rang with something far sweeter, respect. And as Daniel slipped his hand into hers, her fingers trembled as they always had. But neither of them wished they were any different, because those trembling hands had built a life filled with compassion, hope, and a love that had quietly transformed not only 2 lonely hearts, but an entire community. 30 years passed more quickly than either Clara or Daniel could have imagined. The seasons came and went across the rolling prairie surrounding Ash Hollow. Spring always painted the meadows with wildflowers, summer filled the fields with golden wheat, autumn covered the hills in fiery reds and oranges, and winter blanketed the Mercer Ranch in quiet white snow. Through every season, one thing remained unchanged. Clara's hands still trembled. Age had deepened the shaking rather than softened it. Pouring tea required both hands now. Buttoning her dresses took longer each morning, and writing in the ranch ledger demanded patience she had learned over many years. Yet whenever Daniel reached for her hand, the trembling no longer embarrassed her. It simply reminded them both of the promise that had begun their life together. "I only need them to hold mine." Those words had become the quiet foundation of their marriage. The Mercer Ranch had become one of the warmest places in the county. Children who had once learned to read in Clara's parlor were now adults with families of their own. Travelers still found a hot meal waiting at the farmhouse, and no widow or orphan was ever turned away from the Mercer's table. People no longer remembered Clara as the woman with shaking hands. They remembered her as the woman who had never stopped giving. One crisp October morning, Daniel failed to come in from feeding the horses. Clara looked through the kitchen window and saw him sitting on the fence instead of working. He was breathing heavily. She hurried outside as quickly as her aging legs allowed. "Daniel?" He smiled faintly. "I think I overworked myself." She rested a trembling hand against his shoulder. "You've never admitted that before." "I suppose old age catches everyone." Although he tried to laugh, the sound ended in a painful cough. The town doctor examined him later that afternoon. Afterward, he quietly asked Clara to step onto the porch. "I'm afraid Daniel's heart is growing weak." Clara's own heart sank. "Can you help him?" "I can make him comfortable." She understood what he wasn't saying. Some illnesses could not be cured. Winter arrived early that year. Snow gathered along the porch railings while strong winds rattled the farmhouse windows. Daniel spent more time resting beside the fireplace than riding across the pastures. One evening, he looked toward the rocking chair where Clara was struggling to thread a needle. After several attempts, she smiled and set it aside. "I've never beaten that needle." Daniel chuckled softly. "No. But you've beaten everything else." She crossed the room and sat beside him. His once powerful hands had grown thin and pale. Without thinking, she slipped her trembling fingers into his. He closed them gently between both of his hands. "There they are." She smiled through tears. "My troublesome hands. My favorite hands." For several quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window. Finally Daniel whispered, "Do you remember the day you dropped the teacup? I remember wanting the floor to swallow me. I remember thinking I'd never met a braver woman." Clara shook her head. "I wasn't brave. You stayed kind after losing everything. That's bravery." Over the following weeks, Daniel grew weaker. The children Clara had once taught came to visit with their own sons and daughters. Neighbors brought warm meals, chopped firewood, and tended the livestock. The kindness that Clara and Daniel had poured into the community for decades now returned to them many times over. One afternoon, little Emma, the granddaughter of the girl Clara had first taught to read, sat beside Daniel's bed. "Grandpa Daniel," she asked, "why do you always hold Grandma's hand?" Daniel smiled. "Because it reminds me what's important." Emma looked curiously at Clara's trembling fingers. "They still shake." "They always will. Doesn't that bother you?" Daniel looked lovingly at his wife. "No. They've never let go when I needed them." Emma thought about that for a long moment before quietly taking Clara's other hand. "I like them too." Clara wiped away another tear. As spring approached once more, Daniel knew his journey was nearing its end. One peaceful evening, the bedroom window stood open just enough to let in the scent of fresh rain. Birds sang outside, welcoming another season. Clara sat beside him, holding his hand exactly as she had every day since his illness began. Her fingers trembled against his skin. Daniel slowly opened his eyes. "Clara. I'm here. I've been thinking." She smiled softly. "You always do." He gathered the last of his strength. "Years ago. You told me your hands shook too much to sew or cook." She nodded. "I remember. I was wrong." She frowned gently. "What do you mean?" "I said I only needed them to hold mine." He smiled. "But they did so much more. They raised children who weren't ours. They welcomed strangers. They healed lonely hearts. They built a home." He lifted her trembling hand and kissed it gently. Those hands were always enough. Tears streamed down Clara's face. "I love you. I know." His smile remained peaceful. "And I'll keep holding your hand." Just from the other side. With Clara's trembling fingers wrapped securely around his own, Daniel Mercer quietly slipped into eternity. Months later, Clara sat alone on the familiar front porch as the evening sun dipped below the prairie. The rocking chair beside her stood empty. Yet she no longer felt alone. Children still came to borrow books. Neighbors still stopped by for coffee. Travelers still found a warm welcome at the Mercer Ranch. Daniel's kindness lived on through every life they had touched together. Clara looked down at the simple gold wedding ring resting on her trembling hand. The shaking had never disappeared. It never would. But she no longer saw weakness when she looked at those hands. She saw decades of love, comfort, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. As the golden light faded across the fields, Clara gently closed her fingers around the ring and smiled. True love had never asked her to be perfect. It had only asked her to keep reaching out, even when her hands shook. And in doing so, those trembling hands had held far more than Daniel's. They had held hope. They had held compassion. They had held an entire community together. And that was more than enough.